Remember this masterpiece on piracy in the 2000s? So this was a commercial made during a time when everyone was pirating songs and movies. But thanks to the golden age of streaming the decade after, piracy actually went quiet while we were happily binging Breaking Bad.
You got me.
But during the same time, something else was happening where we're starting to see the effects of it today. Around the same time in the 2000s, private equity firms quietly started buying up your favorite studios, just like they're doing today with housing in all those now bankrupt companies. But why should you care? Well, fast forward to today, and the average American pays $1,300 per year for streaming services just to still see ads. And because of this, people are boarding the pirate ship again. But oh yeah, private equity is also now starting to expand to sports teams and now even your favorite YouTubers. But what if I told you that piracy is now one of the only ways people can fight back against private equity during a time when you can't find jobs, afford housing, and you're paying Chipotle in 4 different installments? I think what other videos get wrong about this topic is that this goes way beyond having to pay more for Netflix. Because if culture is truly America's biggest export, private equity is about to take it all for themselves. And if piracy doesn't win this fight, we might lose the last thing that Americans can actually agree on.
Piracy is a result of bad service.
30 to 40% of all internet traffic is piracy.
Even if piracy is illegal, it is an act of rebellion so important that doing it is your moral and civil duty.
So to understand piracy's comeback, we first have to start with how private equity secretly started buying up the entertainment industry without any of us really knowing. Because it's important context for you to understand by the end of the video on why everything we watch nowadays sucks, well, except my videos of course, and why this battle between piracy and private equity goes beyond entertainment. So for decades, small sets of executives and CEOs controlled Hollywood and took all the profits. And now that's still true, it's just they don't really work for themselves anymore. Because almost every aspect of entertainment has sold out to private equity. Take the studio behind this intro. Yeah, there's a reason why we don't see that lion anymore. So MGM Studios owned James Bond, Rocky, massive franchises, but in the 2000s, they started flopping. MGM was drowning in debt and looking for a way out. And so people started circling around MGM. And in 2005, Sony and several private equity firms bought MGM for $5 billion using a leveraged buyout. Like I explained in my previous videos on how private equity is buying up homes and companies, they use this leveraged buyout to make that deal happen. So they put in around $1 to $2 billion in cash, and the rest, the $3 billion, was funded through debt. Which of course that debt is loaded onto the company that they acquire, so MGM now held even more debt when they started. After being bought out, 15% of staff were laid off, divisions were folded, all to squeeze short-term savings and make the math on paper look better. But even after cutting costs, MGM was still saddled with debt, and the movies that they were putting out were flopping, so they filed for bankruptcy just 5 years later in 2010. Since then, MGM has been passed around like a blunt from one private equity firm to another, each extracting value until in 2022, Amazon finally swallowed it all up. I'll get more into that later, but what's important to take away from this is that this MGM deal in 2005 kicked off a gold rush. And soon after, movie theaters like AMC and Cinemark went to private equity, Nielsen, the TV ratings company, to Blackstone and KKR, DreamWorks, Miramax, and even talent agencies like WME, all bought by private equity. And just like MGM, all these companies were gutted by cutting creative staff, which boosted stock prices short term. And the playbook was laid out where private equity firms saw just how much short-term profits that they can make from advisory and management fees, but especially from flipping the studio's media library. Similar to the mortgages in 2008, these libraries could be chopped up and financialized, licensed and resold to streamers like Netflix. But later on, as they saw with MGM, and once fees and value has been fully extracted and squeezed out, years later, a lot of them were also resold or even bankrupted like MGM, and these studios, banks, and bond investors took a hit on that debt. So the private equity firms that play their cards right profited a lot, but what it fundamentally changed was the profit incentive in Hollywood, which stopped becoming about actually making good movies to make more money, and instead the incentive became all about short-term profits. So if all this was happening during the late 2000s and 2010s, how the hell have none of us heard that Hollywood was literally being bought out? We're literally talking about an industry where paparazzi report on the littlest, dumbest things that a celebrity does. Well, because Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, Rolling Stones, and IndieWire are all owned by Penske Media Corporation. And guess who backs PMC? Private equity. So the very outlets that should have been reporting on this buyout spree were all owned by the same financial interests. But now, as you can imagine with the cracks showing, over the last 5 to 7 years, these sorts of investments into Hollywood has dried up. And you know, there's other reasons such as rising interest rates and the reality that streaming platforms don't really make that much money. But one of the biggest reasons was the return of piracy by consumers. And that's where we're really starting to see this battle today of piracy and private equity. And the one that adapts the fastest will win. But believe it or not, for creators like me, it's a similar battle. That's why I use my sponsor, Opus Clip. And they've grown way beyond clipping. Now it's one of the most powerful AI growth tools for creators. And with automated workflows, my long videos get pulled in, auto-edited into clips, and soon even scheduled to post while offline. The new editor is faster than ever with fresh caption styles, and their upgraded Reframe Anything is basically autopilot for framing. It locks onto your subject perfectly, but you can still take control whenever you want. Apart from my channel, Opus has also powered creators like Jubilee, Mark Rober, and Tom Segura with clips hitting tens of millions of views. It's not just editing, it's growth. So don't gamble on your content strategy. Try Opus Clip with the link below for 1 week free plus 3 months at 50% off and see how much faster you can grow. So now back to the video. And unlike the housing or companies that private equity is buying up, consumers might actually be winning this battle. So how exactly did private equity accidentally fuel piracy's comeback? Because in 2024, 25% of people today admitted to pirating content, where just a few years ago, piracy was at record lows. But here's the thing that most people don't realize is that most people don't actually want to pirate. They're pushed into it by the very same cycle that we see with so many private equity plays. At first, piracy took off because people don't want to pay for every movie. Then streaming fixed that. Netflix killed blockbuster movie theaters and especially piracy because people actually got real value. But now piracy is back because that value is becoming less and less and less. So what changed? Well, 3 things. And the first one being is jacking up prices. I think it's pretty obvious, but streaming costs have nearly doubled over the past decade, far outpacing inflation. But it's not just in movies and TV shows. In fact, sports is where we're seeing these rising prices the most. Because when investing in studios flopped, they just moved into sports. We're talking investments into Chelsea, AC Milan, not Arsenal though, just saying. And they're even spending billions buying leagues. CVC Capital invested $2.1 billion for a 10% stake in Spain's La Liga. And the big bet behind all these moves was on live sports broadcasting revenues because they assumed that it was going to be a lot more piracy proof. But they were wrong. Today, 84% of online sports fans have used pirate services at least occasionally. Pay-per-view fights lose up to 30% of their buys to piracy. And La Liga's president says that Spanish clubs lose 600 to 700 million euros each season to piracy. So the very assets that private equity thought were safe are now being eaten alive by piracy. Which leads me directly to my second point of fragmentation, and this is where you really start seeing it all come together. Because a big reason sports is becoming a lot more expensive for fans to follow is take the Denver Nuggets of the NBA. It costs around $1,300 because you need multiple streaming platforms in order to watch every game. And all these exclusivity and silos is the exact same story with movies and TV shows. Now you need Netflix for Stranger Things, Disney Plus for Marvel, HBO to watch The Sopranos, and Peacock for The Office. Where before, it used to all be on one platform. Remember cable? In this artificial scarcity where private equity consolidates content under exclusive platforms, instead of licensing it broadly, is exactly what's pushing more people to pirate again. Which leads me directly to the third point, in that they're deliberately making the experience worse. Under pressure from investors like private equity, nearly every major streamer now has enforced password crackdowns and even charging extra for ad-free viewing. And now we're getting to the point where some force ads on you, no matter what the hell you pay.
First down. Here's
Whopper.
Red Zone has been around since 2009, $15 a month to watch multiple NFL games ad-free. But in 2024, they slowly started adding overlay ads, and literally just as I was making this video, NFL Red Zone has introduced full commercials. And as you can imagine, people are pissed, and they're even talking about boycott. So it remains to be seen if people actually will, but you can clearly see this vicious cycle. Private equity invests, expands by offering good value, then squeezes the value by cutting costs and raising prices in a process called enshittification, and then piracy makes a comeback. And it takes some sort of external event like a disruption, like Netflix did to Blockbuster, where the cycle restarts once again and private equity starts funding that new disruption and infiltrating the cycle yet again. It's literally what happened with Uber when they disrupted the taxi industry by expanding quickly with artificially low prices, but now prices are up, driver pay is cut.
The money that we take has gradually been going down, and it's at its worst right now.
And service quality, I feel like, is dropping. And now private equity might be learning from the past and moving even steps ahead in making sure that the cycle now always starts benefiting them. Just like they shifted investments from movie studios to sports teams, they're now also starting to fund anti-piracy companies like Core Search and Muzo. And look, this is pure speculation, but just days before the Red Zone announcement, one of the biggest piracy sports sites called Streamies, that I've definitely never used, was shut down. And I think one thing to keep your eye on is that they're even starting to fund your favorite YouTuber.
Veritasium, Donut Media, Simple History, Fern, Fireship, Economics Explained, Mentor, Pilot, Futurism, Astrum, The Drive, and History Hits have all publicly been acquired by private equity.
So I feel like I don't have to say this because I like to think of my audience, you watching, as smart. But let me be clear, just because private equity invests in something doesn't automatically make it bad. But point is, private equity is expanding into entertainment quickly. And I think a lot of people's frustration comes from feeling powerless, like you and I have just no choice as private equity continues to infiltrate every aspect of American life. Whether it's private equity buying your company and laying people off, or buying entire neighborhoods. But the twist here in this instance is that consumers actually have a weapon with piracy. Think about it. When private equity buys up homes and jacks up rent, you can't do anything. You can't pirate a roof over your head. Moving costs thousands and takes months. So when it comes to housing, you're trapped. But with entertainment, you have options. If Netflix pisses you off, you can cancel with 2 clicks. If they split your favorite show across 5 different apps, you just pirate it instead, which I'm not advocating for. But point is, one pirate upload means millions can watch without anyone paying. So as private equity try to squeeze entertainment, it's a rare case where people have been able to fight back and vote with their wallets, and it's undeniably eating into private equity's investments. So it sounds like consumers are finally winning against private equity, right? Not exactly. Because again, what no one has talked about is that at the end of the day, this vicious cycle goes beyond entertainment. The key issue behind this is that it's tearing apart American culture itself. And if something isn't done, our growing divide is only about to get worse. Not long ago, Americans actually had shared experiences. Hit movies, chart-topping songs, water cooler moments that every gender, class, and race could find some sort of common ground in. In 1983, 100 million people, that's like a third of our population by the way, watched the season finale of this TV show called MASH. But when was the last time that we found any sort of commonality like this in anything? Game of Thrones in 2019 might have been like the last show that we all watched together, and that finale only drew 20 million viewers in comparison. And look, I know what you're thinking. I get it that it sounds wild that I'm saying that not having one thing that everyone watches affects society at large, and that it's really not that deep, but just please stick with me here. We're living in a time where America is more divided than ever, and in fact, you watching probably hate at least 30% of the population. We have different feeds, different facts, and different shows that confirm our biases and make us hate the other side. Believe it or not, movies and TV shows used to be a bridge, a common reference point where we can actually agree on something no matter your politics, paycheck, or zip code. But now with enshittification and everything just being this woke remake of the same story and formula just because it's a safer bet on return on investment, how are we ever going to have the next Breaking Bad or Sopranos? In fact, when's the last time that there's been a culturally significant Disney movie like we all grew up on? Snow White, Lion King, Toy Story, Finding Nemo, that your grandma or little cousin could both enjoy at the same time. And even in sports, Americans can't even be on the same team. USA basketball winning Olympic gold is treated like a given, and we're even hosting the FIFA World Cup next year here in the States, but unless you love soccer like I do, I don't think most Americans care or are gonna root for the national team. And so maybe I'm being a little bit dramatic, but we're really at this point now where we're facing the death of the monoculture. And not to sound corny, but any hope for unity that came with it. Look, private equity didn't start this, but they did change the incentive from making better entertainment that advances culture to creating brain rot slop for short-term profit. And if culture has been America's biggest export, what happens when our product isn't good enough to bind us here in our own country or to carry our soft power around the world? But you know what? Who the hell am I to say anything considering this is my third video on private equity because, look, I know it's gonna perform. That's the game. I'm not telling you to pirate. I can't say that legally. But what I am saying is that piracy is a symptom and not the problem. And maybe it's wishful thinking, but maybe piracy isn't only about saving money, but maybe it's about saving what's left of a shared culture. And what I realize is that there's definitely truth behind the saying, give them bread and circuses and they won't revolt. And my hope is if the circus sucks, people are actually gonna do something about it. And so I want to dive even deeper into this next week in my free newsletter in the video descriptions. So go sign up because I want to even hear your thoughts on it. But if you haven't seen my last video on private equity, go and watch this video on how private equity broke America's housing. And also like this video. Thanks.